I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So welcome to the Central Safety Group September event. I'm the President of Central Safety Group. If you require more information about the Central Safety Group, please go to our website. Just for housekeeping today, there's a large group in the boardroom, so I'll have to rely on David or Marina to maintain the sound levels in the room. But if you actually are online, please mute during the presentation. You can use the chat function for asking questions, but there will be an opportunity at the close of the meeting to also ask some questions once we close the Zoom. So it's September. We welcome David Caple, one of our regulars and one of our special guests we always look forward to. Professor David Caple, AM, works at the Centre for Ergonomics and Human Factors at Trobe University. And he's going to sort of share some insights of new thoughts into the role of ergonomics. And so I'm not going to spoil your thunder by saying what you've been doing and up to. So I'll turn over to David and to his presentations. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for the invitation again this year to join the Central Safety Group. I'm not sure exactly how many years we've been doing this, but it's been a pleasure of mine to come along in September. And originally we started this when I was on the Ministerial Advisory Group with WorkSafe, and I used it as an opportunity to talk about what WorkSafe was doing and what we were doing in other industries, but I haven't been on that for a few years now. But this year, when I spoke with Jane, I thought it would be good to just reflect a bit on what I'm learning through some of the conferences that I've been going to. So you'll have to join me for a journey. We're going to 2 conferences this afternoon. The first one is in France, which was the Organisational Design and Management Conference from the International Ergonomics Association. And then we're going to flip over to Malaysia, to the Malaysian Ergonomics Conference. France was in July and Malaysia was in August. And it's quite interesting the way they run these conferences now. I think they really struggle to get people to come. Like most of us have got used to doing things digitally. And so the proceedings are not out yet, so I can't actually share with you the actual papers yet. But if there's anything I mention that interests you, just send me an email and happy to share it when they become available. So I'll find the right button. Which one do we go for? Oh, the Zoom one? No? Sorry, guys, we're just playing with technology here. So that was the screen we had before. Yeah, we're right. We're cooking on gas. So for those that have been to my previous presentations, there's my goofy face on the screen, but I'm with a few other people. And I wanted to share this photo because the guy who's on the opposite end of that photo, a lot of you should know if you've been coming to Central Safety Group.
Pierre Falzon.
Correct. Mars bar for you. So Pierre was a guest speaker here probably 20 odd years ago when he visited Australia. And he's retired now, but he came to this conference in Bordeaux. He was actually the organizer of the conference with some of his students from Paris. The other people in the middle, I'll mention who they are because I'm going to mention some of their research as we go through this. So beside Pierre is Andrew Thatcher, who's from the university, or they call it Wits University in South Africa, in Johannesburg. In the middle is Pascal Carrion, and Pascal is probably, I'd have to say, the most well-known ergonomist in the world. She was at University of Wisconsin in America, and she basically has led the whole healthcare ergonomics journey. She's now retired, well, not really retired, but she had her protest against President Trump and left America. and went back to live in France. So she's now working in France. And then the chap beside me is Andrew or Andy Yamada, who's from California. And so just in terms of the International Ergonomics Association, Pierre was the president before me and Andy was the president after me. We wanted Pascal, but she was too busy. So she's still actively involved in the ergonomics world though. So that's some of the people I'll talk about. For those that haven't been to Bordeaux, it's the most beautiful city. And it was really a privilege to be there for a week. And I just want to talk about this paper that I did with Andy, but also with Karen from Colombia and Jan Doel. And Jan Doel is also a very well-known ergonomist from Europe. And Jan, he's one of the few people who is an ergonomist who works in the Department of Management. So he basically works with managers to understand how to integrate ergonomics into a whole range of industries. And he's just come back from America and there were 2,500 delegates there and he was the only ergonomist. And he had a very big impression. He's just such a wonderful guy. So that's who we were. Karen is, as it says there, is from Colombia. Just as an aside, Karen and Andy and I are drafting a new publication on, it's called Ergonomics in a Nutshell, but it's designed for managers to understand in a nutshell what's ergonomics about. So look out for that. It probably will come out next year. There's already one publication out for C-suite leaders, which is the top, CEO type leaders on ergonomics. You can have a look at that through the IEA website if you're interested in that. So there's been a few of these publications. Karen is the lead on this one. So I just want to talk about the definition of ergonomics. I know we go around this merry-go-round all the time, but just to emphasize that the definition is about a systems approach that takes theory and principles and data and so forth with the objective to improve human well-being and systems performance. And I want today just to talk about, is that 50-50? Is that, 80-20? What do we have in our conversation about this? And this is relevant to this publication for managers about, is it about the health and well-being of your staff, or how do we describe systems performance? So Jan gave a paper in our thing in Bordeaux. He's evaluated just over 1,000 workplaces and tried to get data on where they spend money. And you'll see from that table that the average investment targeted towards human well-being was €4,000 in intervention, but to target systems performance was €137,000. And just for other factors was only 4,000 as well. And so Jan's point is, if you really want industry to spend money, focus on system performance and how it's going to assist that company or that industry towards however they define system performance. So if we just have a look at, this was a discussion that Andy Yamada ran, is that in organisational culture, bear in mind this was a conference on organisational design, but if you look at what organisations come back to, it's either KPIs or it's their values. And I must admit, when I deal with boards and senior people and you ask them about what are your motivators for looking at human well-being, they talk about, oh, well, we want to be not injuring anybody, and how do you measure that? And because a lot of the injuries like stress and musculoskeletal, I define as discretionary, as distinct from broken bones, because I might have a bad back and you would never know. It's at my discretion if I tell you. And so you've got this huge iceberg model of the waterline shifts up and down with discretionary issues depending on organisational culture. And so often the data is a reflection of culture. It's not a reflection of risk. The risks are there, but if people don't talk about it, they don't show up in the data. And so what Andy was saying is that we just need to understand what the industry is and what they value in system performance. So if it's a sales-based industry, how is my intervention going to influence revenue? If it's an engineering, how is it going to ensure precision and accuracy of the product? And so forth. If it's finance, return on capital. If it's a craft, the quality. And design related is enhancing the beauty and elegance. So Andy's argument is what's important for them is what we focus on. So what do they value? Then that's what we argue. And so what he says is that we're going to talk about proper posture, and we're talking about a productivity-based company. Then how does investing in better posture produce better productivity? Or if we're going in health, we're going to do safe manual handling for patients. How's that going to produce a healthier outcome for that patient? And so it's just a different way of structuring the language. And I've just got a couple of examples here where I've been involved. And it's interesting, in today's newspaper, there's an article by Cathy McGowan, who was an independent member up at Indi in Victoria. She was in Canberra last night talking about agriculture and women. And what she was saying was a lot of the drive for new IT in agriculture is because there isn't enough labour who are living in regional Australia where manual type work is sustainable. And that photo of the truck with all the bales on it, I took down at Inverleigh just a few months ago on the Hamilton Highway. And what they found in old hay baling days, we used to get a lot of injuries from baling of hay. Sheds used to burn down from the heat. You know, there was a lot of wasted product.
Blocks, they used to call them.
It is blocks, yeah. I tried it for 2 days. It was too hard for me. But anyway, that industry, when we investigated the transition into these big round bales, the major driver was they couldn't get labour to actually bale all those idiot blocks to the volumes that they needed in country Australia. And so now what they've done, not only do they have these that can store anywhere out in the weather, but they've now got trucks that have got the delivery device attached to the back, like in construction. You see there's a lot around Australia at the moment. And so they can deliver it 24/7. They don't need to have labour at the other end to unload it. So that integrated design has produced enormous quality benefits for the product, productivity benefits for the farmer. And it was a very costly investment, but the payback has been there. And it's eliminated manual handling injuries because you don't have to manually do it. And similarly with the rubbish truck, we're familiar with that. And of course, that was an area where we had fatalities, where the garbos used to get run over by the truck as they were trying to do stuff behind and other vehicles. So it's been a huge investment, but a huge change. So I think when we look at some of these industries, so in manufacturing, for example, when you look at confectionery, the robots that are now taken over that industry is that every piece of chocolate is A1. So you don't end up with scrap, you don't end up with rework, you don't end up with repetitious injuries to all those people who used to manually sort them and pack them. And similarly, in the beverage industry, there's a lot of devices now that can eliminate manual handling when they're doing order picking by just grabbing the layers and placing them on the store pallets. And I'm a bit familiar with that industry. So what they do now is that if a store says, I want, 4 layers of Coca-Cola, and it comes in a pallet of 6, they actually override it and say, actually, you're going to get 6, and send them the whole pallet. So there's a lot of logic now, AI used in the system to actually eliminate damage to product and time and cost to the system. So I suppose the picture I'm painting today is that when you talk about human wellbeing and system performance, it's a matter of understanding what does system performance mean in the context of that industry and linking the two together. So Jan Dool published this paper a few years ago now, and what he was basically saying is that happy, well people perform better, and performing people are generally more happy because they're not dealing with breakdowns and reject and problems. So it's a win-win. So he is actually encouraging us that when we talk about ergonomics, don't just talk about injuries and things that go wrong, but look at the sustainable interventions and how they can improve system performance. A couple of other things from that conference. Apologies if the text is a bit small, but one of the interesting speakers was Dave Woods, and he basically coined this new area called resilience engineering. And I put all these under this heading of change management. And he was basically looking at the space capsule that went bang in after takeoff and looking at complex systems and how complex systems failures need to understand the concept of brittleness or resilience engineering. And so that when you are designing a whole system and you're looking, say, in manufacturing, there are many bits where failure can occur. And his whole approach is to look holistically at failure analysis and understand where engineering changes should be done and thought through from a human factors perspective. If you want to get a copy of my presentation, which I'll give to Marina, there's a link there to a really interesting talk that Dave Woods gave about this whole area of resilience engineering. Marianne Seff from France, she talked a lot about what she called transition management. And she was basically saying that hardest part often in doing ergonomics is the change piece. We know what we want to achieve, we know, and we've justified why it's important. And she talked about the political and the social barriers towards acceptance of change. And there's a lot of work done by this European Environmental Agency relating to understanding transition to change. And I think that implementation journey is another part of our toolkit that she's helped with. I mentioned Pascal. I'll talk a bit later about sustainability, but Pascal was saying, please don't use that word about ergonomics, because if you say that our intervention is sustainable because it's reduced injury and it's a better system, then it introduces complacency to say, well, we've ticked that box. She says, no, you must constantly do the loop of continuous improvement. You need to audit, you need to survey, you need to understand why things are the way they are, because you've got new workers churning through a process and they will have new ideas and new perceptions on risk. So she's very keen to look at continuous improvement. Sidney Decker, he did a presentation on the Boeing 737 MAX 8, you know, the two terrible disasters where the plane crashed, and basically nailed that back to human factors and ergonomics. And it was fascinating. I mean, I haven't got time to go through the details of it, but simplistically, Airbus had come out with a new long-range 737 model, which Boeing sort of got caught on the hop. So his explanation was they needed a larger engine, but it didn't fit under the wing of 737 for Boeing. So they did a mount out the front of the engine to enable it to sit higher. But that changed the horizontal pitch when they were flying. So they put a sensor beside the pilot's cabin that monitored the pitch. But for whatever reason, and he's very impassioned about this, they didn't have a redundancy. They didn't have two, they only had one. And so if it failed and the pilot was in cloud and the plane started to do this, then they wouldn't necessarily get the data they needed to make the decision of what to do. And his explanation was that when planes start doing that, they get to a point where they just lose control, and 2 of them smashed. But it was that information transfer that just was poorly thought through, and redundancy that wasn't thought through, basic ergonomics in design. Eric, he talks about safety 1 is 0 harm, which is human wellbeing and no injury. But he says that the argument now is about safety 2, which is about all of the above that we talked about, of system performance. And that he's basically going back to the original definition and saying, let's talk about both. I know it's difficult for a regulator because you're there to save injuries, but in relation to those investments that Jan Dool was talking about, they were primarily justified on system performance, not on human wellbeing. So let's flick over to Malaysia, which was just a couple of weeks ago. And in this photo, the smaller woman there is Halimatun Khalid, and she was on the executive with me, and she ran our big congress in China. Very capable woman. She's just lost her husband recently, who was Professor Martin Hellander. And Martin was a previous president of the IAA, Swedish guy, wonderful guy. So this was just after he died, and because of their Muslim requirements, she was in mourning for 3 months and X days. So she decided to come, but she wasn't able to socialise, so forth. But she was the force behind the conference. The woman beside her is a fascinating woman who spends the majority of her voluntary time living in the forest in Malaysia with their indigenous communities, looking at agriculture and how she can support them in a way that is culturally acceptable and safe. Really interesting role. The other old grey-haired beside is my wife, and we just finished a bike hike in Vietnam, so we're feeling a bit fatigued at the time, but she came along as well. The big issue in Malaysia, they were talking about the journey we're on industrially and saying we're now into Industry 4.0, and that has really moved us off from the introduction of computers and automation now into artificial intelligence, cyber and networked computer systems and integrated technologies. And a lot of the papers in Malaysia was about industries where AI is having an impact, and to what extent will that impact on ergonomics. And I must admit, I was taken a bit aback. It's enormous. I hadn't probably really appreciated it. And this was just a graph that was provided on research done by PwC. And if you look at the industries there that are projected to be significantly impacted on jobs, manufacturing, transport and logistics, all the ones that we probably are working in now, and just trying to understand what does that mean in terms of job design? What does it mean in terms of interaction with technology systems? And I suppose the good news that I took out of it is that whilst AI and technology systems will automate and pre-populate a lot of the information side, the growth area is in the human-to-human interaction side. And that any industry like the arts, for example, will continue to boom and grow because people have a hunger for things that ingratiate their emotions, their souls, their empathy, their support of other humans. But and what they're saying is that the AI and the computer systems doesn't have that capacity, but it will have a huge impact on manufacturing and finance, for example. I mentioned that little publication we're doing with the IAA. Karen in Colombia the way she researches publications now is to start with ChatGPT. So she puts all the questions and the keywords into ChatGPT and looks at what everything comes out and then says, okay, if that's the starting point, what do we now do? And we had this conversation in Malaysia with a guy from Singapore, and he was saying that his 10-year-old daughter at school is now taught to use ChatGPT as the starting point for their homework, and then put in their case studies and their interpretation of what's going on. She's 10. Could you believe it? Yeah. So, you know, this industry 4.0 is a fascinating one. I suppose it was quite sobering to balance it. So this is Andrew Thatcher, who was the guy from Wits University in South Africa. It's not his slide, but I just sort of made it up based on what he was talking about. So he was talking about the triple bottom line, and not only talking about well-being, but talking about profitability and sustainability. And he has a lot of data and a lot of sobering stories about the impact of climate change. And basically saying that when we're doing what we do, we need to be very conscious of the impact on the climate and the sustainability debate. And it made me think that those of us who work in ergonomics, one of the areas that we often get asked to participate is the Green Star and the Well and the LEED assessments, which is what a lot of buildings now, like this one we're sitting in at the moment, will try to get a Green Star tick for sustainability when they, because the owners like that. It's about recycling water and heat and energy and lighting and furniture and equipment and all that sort of thing. And I've probably done about 50, not that many, let's say 30 of these since that system started. But in the last couple of years, I've just noticed some of the big companies are reusing stuff. They're saying, what's wrong with these for a boardroom? Why would we need to get something better? So it's a real tension with the architects and designers saying, yes, but these are old and, you know, I've got something better and bigger. And they're saying, well, let's do the calculation. What would the carbon impact be if we were to transport 20 of these from our office in Sydney and reuse them and not replace them? And, you know, the composition of what the table's made out of and the frame and the aluminium and so forth. So the whole debate now of integrating ergonomics into sustainability is very much alive around the traps. And Andrew is probably the leader of that. I'll just finish and then we can have a chat about MSD, because I know a lot of people in ergonomics are very involved in that. I looked up the data in Malaysia, and 4% of their reported injuries into their workers' comp scheme were related to musculoskeletal. But when I look at Safe Work Australia and their latest data, it's like 37%. And when you look at the actual injury descriptions and you include musculoskeletal with soft tissue, it's about 50%. And you think, we're an advanced country here. How do we end up with something quite different to a developing country? And it often comes back to the definition of what do we mean by a musculoskeletal disorder versus what do they count as a workers' comp-based system. And so I think despite all the research and everything that we all try to do in this space, our measurable KPI is a bit questionable of how we're going versus other countries. And just in terms of some of the tools, the UK has now developed a new tool called ART, Assessment of Repetitive Tasks. Those who have studied ergonomics, you probably would have studied the ruler and the rebar, which are the repetitive upper limb type methodology. So this is another one. So if you're interested in having a look at it, it's quite a good one that you can follow up afterwards. And it's mainly to do manufacturing and those sorts of things. It's not really for, say, musculoskeletal from office space. So it's not intended for screen-based equipment type assessments. It gives a score, it uses traffic light method, and it basically uses the four basic the criteria of frequency, force, postures, and organisational factors. So it's a more simpler model, say, than the WorkSafe model, but it's only to do with upper limb. So have a look at that if you're interested in trying it. The other one is from La Trobe Uni. I think a lot of you who have trained at La Trobe would be familiar with the firm, and it's got its 5 stages. And the reason I've put it back into this year's chat is just that Jody Oakman, who developed this tool with others, has just revitalised it. So there's some new bits of information in it. And so basically it's developed at La Trobe in Melbourne, and it's one of the few tools that talks about the psychosocial factors as well as the physical factors. And the people at La Trobe have done a lot of work on that interface between the two. There is the Australian Human Factors and Ergonomics Society conference in Adelaide is in November. So we wave the flag and say if you can go or virtually subscribe, you know, please do. And Jody's going to run a workshop on this tool during that conference that's there. Just in terms of, so I think that's all I really want to cover before we can have a chat. But the International Ergonomics Association, as you know, we hosted that here in 2015 in Melbourne. It's only every 3 years, and next year it's going to be in Korea. So if you're planning your overseas trips for next year, about later in the year, you might like to go via Korea and join that conference. So there's the 2 conferences I went to, the Malaysian one and the ODAM one, they tend to happen less frequently now, but there are many others. The biggest one, as I mentioned, Pascal with healthcare, they have quite a few conferences around the world. If you're interested in musculoskeletal, there's a conference called PREMUS, P-R-E-M-U-S, Prevention of Musculoskeletal, and they've got a conference in India coming up, and they are big conferences as well. Interesting, in the healthcare one, I mentioned earlier about patient safety and injuries to staff. The biggest part of the ergonomics conference in healthcare is not that. It's actually cognitive ergonomics and issues associated with inappropriate medication treatments, fatigue management, conflict, and issues that relate to the organisational way that hospitals and healthcare systems work. And one of the big areas in that whole industry is the move away from hospitals. And I mean, you would see this now about health in the home or whatever the various descriptors are. And those uncontrolled environments where people are much more vulnerable to a lot of the risk factors which are not there in the hospital. So that industry, I can see, it's, you know, we talked today a bit about Industry 4.0 and artificial intelligence, but I think in other industries, these significant changes will change what the issues are we need to look at in ergonomics as they move forward. So I might oh, okay. Got that?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Excellent. Oh, thank you, David. That was excellent. I can't believe how many buzzwords you managed to fit into one session with AI, resilience, and...
Man, I can't hear you.
I'm off mute.
You can speak now.
Excellent. So, yes, so we can open up to questions from David now, both in the room and also online. If you are online, please make sure your camera's on so that we can see you in the presentation. But maybe I could sort of go to the room first. Does anybody would like a question who's sitting in the room with David?
Okay. So, hi everyone, Christina Rennick from St Vincent's Hospital. So interesting about the AI and that evolution, and one thing we've been talking about at St Vincent's is the use of AI. And interesting, we're talking about virtual and home, because one of our first instances that we've done is pulling data out of patient records to determine who would be suitable for at-home care. So that's one thing that we've done. Another thing that we were looking at is how we can use data and AI to manipulate that data to identify hazards for or risks of our patients coming in. So maybe occupational violence hazards is the one that piqued people's interest, but you know, there could be other hazards as well, in terms of, we were looking at maybe some patient handling risks, and could that be identified before someone was admitted from data we've already got, so that we can develop and set up a room or equipment or whatever that's needed for those people. So certainly things are moving in that, yes, in that dimension, using that information. And yes, all health is moving into that kind of virtual and home work. Yeah, we've set up a new division, which is virtual and home.
Right.
And looking at, and you're right, that trying to manage or control an environment that isn't yours to control becomes, is a challenge.
And that, I mean, that's really interesting you're doing that. I was involved in a project where it was trying to use AI to foresee cognitively impaired patient arrivals. So that's patients with dementia, drug and alcohol, mental health, because a lot of their OBA and emergency was because these people had arrived and they should have known that and been better prepared. Yeah, so being able to draw out that information and make it a flag. A flag, yes, exactly. Anybody else interfacing with AI in any way?
I used it yesterday, the ChatGPT. We're doing a wellbeing program coming up, and I looked up a word for reflex energy.
Was it good?
It was 2 sentences. It saved me coming up with it.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, I think, well, personally, I haven't gone to that as a first port of call. I suppose I'm scared of it in a way, of what it might do. But look, the work that it's Karen's come up with the research it's amazing, really. And there's another package called Perplexity, I think, or something like that. And it gives you all the references of where it's drawn it from. It doesn't just say, you know, these are all the information. And a lot of these references are people that we're talking about today. You know, it's drawing it out of scientific literature. So it's not just out of trashy magazines or something. It's actually evidence-based stuff.
We're having a chat about this in our team meeting, just talking about artificial intelligence as well. And I think someone had to try and input it or asked ChatGPT to provide like references for a specific paragraph or whatever was being asked on the topic. It provided references, but those references weren't actually correct. So it generated specific references, but it didn't actually relate to what the paragraph was saying. Okay. So I don't know if that happened in that instance.
Well, I have to check it.
To actually check the references.
Yeah, I'm not making people worried about that.
Well, some things I want to note that ChatGPT, the free one, is based on 2021 data. So to get the latest information, you have to pay for it, which is the current data. But Google's released a new AI called AI Bard, which uses the current data, but it's not as intuitive as ChatGPT. So I know someone who's in the AI industry, and I've been, you know, how you say this, interested in the AI because it's going to change the world. And you know, there's a certain way to use ChatGPT with certain words, specific parameters, ways to ask around it. And you know, and I asked him, well, what's the way I can learn better how to use it? And he goes, there's a short course called AI for Everyone, developed by Andrew Ng from Stanford, and he was like one of the pioneers for AIs. I've been onto it. So it's, yeah, and it gives you like what are the limitations of what it can do and what it's going to develop.
Mm. So look, it's another chapter for all of us, I think, to understand. And like this whole debate about sustainability and looking at the global climate challenges, I think what I'm learning is that we can't just be narrowly focused in ergonomics on a person, a task, a tool, a design, without looking at the broader systems approach. So I'm not suggesting we need to change the definition of ergonomics. I'm just saying it is a systems model, and those systems elements will mature as the world moves. And it's that balance between the well-being and the however we measure systems performance. And I suppose I've learned over time that ergonomics is often talked about in the education sphere, about all the tools in your bag tricks, you know, the rule of the Reba, the NIOSH, the Michigan 3D, and all these methodologies. And that's really important when you're doing research, because you need to actually be able to verify the theory and test your hypothesis. But when you're involved in practice, you often don't even know what the problem is before you start. You just know the symptoms that people are leaving, or people are complaining, or they're unhappy Vegemite. So you have to start a methodology which draws out what all those measures could be. And more often than not, you don't use any of those quantitative measures because you've already developed some sort of that. I think that one of the good things about the risk management model that is in the laws is it does require you to define the hazard first before you're leaping with controls and risk assessments.
I was going to say, David, one thing it could be useful to remind people is on the Central Safety Group website, we actually do have a, it's not quite a chat function, but certainly if you've got great tools like the HSE art tool, or some of those comments around the ChatGPT or other AI methodologies, if you would like to share it, we can actually share that with the rest of the members if you actually just jump on the website and just put in a short few sentences, and we can share that with others. So that'd be great.
Thanks, Nan.
Barry had a question or a comment in the chat, I think. Yeah. Is he in there?
Oh, yes, Barry, did you want to ask that question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry I missed the first part, David. It was fascinating. But I posted a question in the chat, and I'll just read that. There have been controversies in Vic over comorbidities. You know, we're talking about the Ombudsman, Rosen report, et cetera, to do with MSDs and psychosocial and vice versa. So I was just wondering, because of the issue in Victoria over cost of claims and claims going long term and the difficulty in getting recovery, did the conference touch on this, or what systems are there around that might actually improve those sort of outcomes?
Yeah, good question, Barry. There is a lot of debate around the world about that interaction between a physical musculoskeletal condition and the psychosocial factors. And now, like, for example, in Australia, we have, I think Rachel or one of the other women might like to comment, but it's I think it's called mental health claims now, or the psychological claims seem to be the driver of the cost increase to the scheme. And if I go back 30 years or so, when we had RSI as our big challenge in the community, yes. I learned many things from that, but one of them was that the way that we manage people on that journey is very influential on what direction that journey takes. And so at that time, I think we made the biggest mistake by going around and saying to groups of workers, do you get any sore neck, back, shoulder, arm, ankle, wrist, or whatever? And if they said yes, then they were diverted off, well, you better go and see the doctor, or the physio, or the rheumatologist, or the podiatrist, or whomever, all of whom had their own theory about what to do with them. And the net effect was they all got terribly confused and anxious and worried about, oh my gosh, I don't really know what's going to happen to me in my career. And I think what the issue is that when people make a call on their sore neck or sore shoulder, there's often something else going on in their life which would predict for them to put their hand up and say, I'm now really sore. It may be work-related factors, it may not be work-related factors, but I think it's incumbent on whoever they go to not jump to conclusions about the causation of it and the future direction of it until they've looked really thoroughly at the background of the why now question. So I'm very keen on this understanding a difference between risk and culture, and that many jobs have inherent risk. One of the things that I learned, I don't know if I've told you before, but in that period, I was flying to Washington in America when Bill Clinton was the president, and they set up a ministry of whatever they call it, a congressional inquiry into repetition injury in the United States. And Morris Oxenberg from Sydney and myself were taken there to talk about the Australian experience. And one of the things that happened is that you get put before like the Senate inquiry happens in Canberra, and people ask you difficult questions. And we had 2 days before that happened with lawyers who talked about, well, they might ask you this or whatever. But one of the things we were never allowed to use the word we were being coached, but we were being advised that if you ever get shown a photo and you look at it as an ergonomist and you see your eyes look at things, and this is what they did in this congressional thing. They showed us a series of photos and said, you know, Professor, would you suggest that this is an ergonomic problem, based on what do you see there? And they had the most ridiculous photos of people in stupid postures and doing bizarre things. And you said whatever you said, and then they'd say, thank you very much. And then what happened was they'd then bring in another expert and they'd talk about the lighting, and somebody else would talk about the design of the chair or whatever. And so the whole philosophy was discrediting ergonomics and say, it's not an exact science. They don't know, they can't even agree when they look at the photo. And so what I've learned is never trust a photo until you've actually had a conversation with the people who are doing that job. And so I think one of the strengths of our system is the consultation requirements, which actually you have to verify, well, who did you talk to and what did you ask and how does that relate back to the system of work? Sorry, Barry, I've gone off on a tangent, but I think the issue about MSD is that the biomechanical bits are just one part of the jigsaw puzzle. And that, you know, years ago, we were taught that about 50% of us in the population are carrying a musculoskeletal condition, a funny neck or back or knee or ankle, or, you know, we all play sport, we're all getting old, whatever it might be. And so a lot of the rehab and training programs that assume we're all capable of the same outcome is a rather naive approach, because what might be good for me might aggravate you type of problem. So we need to walk the journey on wherever the individual is at to achieve a sustainable outcome.
And I think that a firm tool is, I mean, if you've got a cluster, suddenly this cluster appears of musculoskeletal injuries, I mean, that a firm tool, we've used that to kind of work through what's going on. And we've got one example where it's our support service workers and who work on the wards. They do the cleaning, they have to change the beds, they have to transport patients, you know, they're busy and they're aging, they're really aging. And they wanted us to look at the ergonomics of certain jobs as part of that, which we did, and it showed nothing. The big thing is some communication stuff between their supervisors and them, and communication to them about what to expect in this day of work. That seems to be one of the big factors that's coming up that's affecting them,
Yeah.
and affecting their ability to feel safe and valued at work.
And that's why when we start a consultation process on any particular workers, I never get out the checklist from the code of practice. I always talk to them in general terms about what makes a good day, what makes a hard day, what do you talk to your family about what makes this a good job, what gets you out of bed in the morning, sort of thing. And all those factors come out, but they come out in a sequence and a language that they feel comfortable to talk about. But if you say, are you subjected to vibration forces, static load, blah, 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 what's the right answer here? It just doesn't work as a consultation tool. You can summarize it on it after that process, but you don't start with it, because I think that just turns a lot of people off. And which would be interesting with the art tool that you mentioned, Nan, because it has the variables on it, but does it actually end up with the same outcome? I think we'll just have to wait and see about that.
Okay, I was going to say, I might finish off the formal session of the program, but certainly those in the room and those online can stay on and actually have a more informal chat at this point of time. So thank you very much, David. As I said, very far-reaching conversation, which touched on just how complex our roles actually are, and trying to determine how we actually make a workplace safer. So food for thought. Next month, we're going to actually have Professor Helen Lingard from RMIT talking about the changing safety culture in construction, which I'm sure will be a very informative and thought-challenging program as well. So thank you, David. Enjoy your time with the group in the boardroom, and I'll catch you all up next month. So thank you very much for attending. Bye-bye.